Thanks very much. I'll speak quite slowly to help you understand. If there's something you don't understand, please say, and I'll happily try to say it in Russian as best I can. Here's the name of my presentation. So hopefully, well, maybe I've made some mistakes, we'll see. But here we have a number of words here. One of them is still in Latin letters, because it's a Greek word. I won't know to put it in Greek, but I'll come on to that term in a minute. So what I'm really going to talk about is the relationship between language and democracy. Language and democracy, especially as understood in Russia at the time of the revolution, but also in the West in current political usage. And of course, when we talk about democracy today, usually what we have in mind is what Marxists call bourgeois democracy. Bourgeois democracy. And bourgeois democracy is a particular type of democracy with very strict limitations. Much of what I've got to say today relates to Greece, ancient Athens in particular. And here we have a contemporary demonstration in Greece that took place when there was a vote to reject the budget imposed by the European Union, and they had to have it anyway. And there was a big demonstration at this time. So when we talk about the limits of bourgeois democracy, well, one thing that bourgeois democracy means is that there's basic freedom of assembly and freedom, we must say freedom of speech, svoboda slova. Now, freedom of speech is very different from another word that I'm going to be using today, which is Isegoria, the Greek word, which I'll come on to in a minute. So it gives you basically freedom of speech, which means that no one's going to stop you basically saying what you think. So freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. Then there's elections, of course, but elections only take place in the, what we might call the sphere of abstract citizenship. So when you elect somebody to the parliament, you elect someone to the council, but you don't elect somebody to the army, you don't elect someone to the police force, you don't elect somebody to the main economic institutions of society, and that's the most important thing. So the important thing is that the economy is excluded from all democratic control. Nobody votes for Bill Gates as head of Microsoft, or the big corporations. Nobody votes for them, except for the shareholders, of course, despite the fact they have very serious influence and power over elected governments. Next thing as well, you elect people, but you don't know who they are. Lots and lots of people elect a small number of people. So there's a big distance between the people who are elected and the people who do the electing. Yeah? And also, if the person you elect suddenly starts to do a lot of things that they said they were not going to do, you can do nothing. You just have to wait until the next election comes around, and then maybe you vote for them or maybe you don't. But if they are elected to do one thing and then do something else, you can't say, well, I'm sorry, that's not what we voted for, we want to re-elect somebody. The only thing you can do is to go out on the street and demonstrate and go on strike and this kind of thing. That's all outside of the limits of bourgeois democracy. Okay? So, this important thing then that the economy and economic power is excluded from democratic control is very important. Now, when we talk about the kinds of how we affect opinions in conditions of bourgeois society, two people are very important in theorising this, who you've probably never heard of: Edward Bernays and Harold Lasswell. Has anybody heard of them? No? You'd be surprised how influential these people are. I'll explain two things about them. Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, okay, went to the United States, and he became what's now called the head of the public relations industry. Public relations, advertising. He was one of the founders of modern advertising. The public relations industry was originally called the propaganda industry. That was originally what it was called. Now, for Bernays, one of the things that was really important for him is he used Freud's ideas to show that if I want to sell something, I don't simply tell you all of the objective qualities of something. I have to appeal to your emotions and irrational side. And this is something he learned from his uncle, that people are irrational. And you have to appeal to their unconscious desires. Now, before this time, advertising was just, they told you more or less what a product was and what it does. But now, how do you appeal to people's emotions in order to get them to buy stuff that they probably don't need, they probably don't want, and probably no good for them? Well, he had a very important role to play in this. And he did, one of the most important things was how do you make cigarettes seem like a torch of freedom, as I put it here, a torch of freedom. Because in the United States in the early 1920s, women didn't smoke, because it was seen to be very male kind of thing to do. It was very unfashionable. So the corporations in the United States were very worried that half of the population were not smoking. There were half of the population not giving their money to them to make profits. So they went to Bernays, and Bernays thought of how to do this, how to get women to smoke. So Edward Bernays is probably responsible for the deaths of millions of women, because he had a very big influence on this. Let me just show you a very short clip of a documentary about this.
Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious. Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it. A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America, and for a large fee he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch, you see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements, it's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent, an idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet embrace.
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and feelings. The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent. It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
So, what Bernays did then was to use the psychoanalysts' methods to make smoking seem sexually attractive and appealing and so on. So, one of the things that Bernays wanted to do then, he had this idea that you can't simply let the masses do what they want and think what they want, you have to control them. They have to be controlled by the big corporations. Deliberately he wanted to do this. And for this he wanted to develop something that he called propaganda, and there's a famous book he writes in 1928 called Propaganda, where he says, propaganda is an invisible government that formulates and propagates a standardized code of social conduct to which we conform most of the time. So this has to be deliberately generated. And then he says what happens is that invisible governors organise chaos by manipulating and redirecting subconscious desires in the cause of enlightened self-interest. So the important thing was that governments must manipulate people in the same way as companies manipulate people in order to be able to buy products. So they vote for them not because rationally they believe that it is good for them, but that it appeals to their emotions and so on in order to be able to do so. Okay? So there was Bernays, an incredibly influential man, still today. The other person I mentioned was Harold Laswell. In 1927, he writes another work on propaganda, where he says we have to combat the democratic dogmatisms that people are the best judges of their own interests. So what must happen is that people at the top of society, elites, must decide, must pronounce what is in the common good and to impose it on people. And this they do by using a new technique of control, largely through propaganda, as he calls it. And that's because the masses are ignorant and superstitious. And so that only certain people in society know better. Right? These people were some of the most important political theorists for the United States democracy of the 1920s, and they very much framed the entire American political system in many respects. People who are largely not spoken about much today. But interestingly, Noam Chomsky, Chomsky I believe is in Russian, they called it the engineering of consent, and Chomsky called it the manufacturing of consent. And here Chomsky writes about this, that the citizen of American democracy is a consumer, an observer, but not a participant. The public has the right to ratify policies that originate elsewhere. But if those limits are exceeded, then we have what they call a crisis of democracy. Not democracy, a crisis of democracy. So if people are not willing simply to accept things passively handed to them, I'll vote that way, that way, and think they might organise things differently, then this is a crisis of democracy, not democracy itself. Okay? So when we talk about propaganda, in this sense, propaganda is a kind of rhetoric. Rhetoric is about convincing people to do things, to believe things. And this notion of propaganda corresponds to that you find in Plato, all the way through Immanuel Kant, all the way to Friedrich Nietzsche. And that conception is that rhetoric is the self-interested manipulation of emotions. It's simply about using emotional stimuli in order to get people to act in certain ways or believe certain things. Now, the notion of propaganda after the Second World War became quite unacceptable, because propaganda in the West was associated with Nazi Germany, Nazi propaganda. So, it was suggested that it was always a matter of deceit, of lying in some way. So what Edward Bernays did was he called propaganda the public relations industry. So that's how it came to be, that's how the terminology goes all the way through. But this was the opposite of another tradition talking about rhetoric, but especially comes from Aristotle. So there's this trend of thought thinking about rhetoric that comes through Plato, Kant, and through to Nietzsche. And then there's another that comes through Aristotle and then goes through Quintilian and another tradition. And that's a notion that rhetoric, persuasive language, is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, any more than a screwdriver or a hammer is a good or a bad thing. You can use it in many different ways for many different ends. So this was the important point. And this is what brings us on to democracy. The term democracy, we use it all the time, usually without thinking what it means. The term in ancient Greek, demokratia, comes from two words, demos and kratos. Now interestingly, when we talk about democracy, it didn't mean the right to vote. It didn't mean the right to select a representative, that's for sure, it didn't mean that. Rather, everything we know about ancient democracy democracy in ancient Athens, we know from its opponents. All of the people who wrote about democracy, Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, were all opponents of democracy. They hated it. Which is interesting. We don't have any positive descriptions of ancient democracy at all. So, what did democracy mean? Well, in Aristotle, it means something very particular. Aristotle says democracy is a constitution in which the freeborn and the poor control the government because they are at the same time a majority. So it means the rule by the poor majority, not by the rich minority. And Aristotle, in his works, contrasts the notion of democracy with oligarchy. An oligarchy is a constitution in which the rich and the better born control the government because they are at the same time a minority. Okay, this is what it meant. So, when we think, and the main principle of democracy in ancient Athens was Isegoria. And it didn't mean freedom of speech. It meant the equality of speech. And there's a very big difference between them. Freedom of speech means you can say what you like, but nobody has any obligation to listen to you. Say what you like, okay, la 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 la. Okay, you can say anything you want, but it doesn't mean anybody has to pay any attention to you. They will listen to those people with money instead. But in ancient Athens, the principle of democracy was that everybody has the same right to, and the same way to be heard in discussions and to have their opinions considered. Okay, so everybody has the same role, because what people did, they all went along to the assembly, and all of the citizenry were able to argue and were able to vote on every issue that affected the community. So this is a really important term then, Isegoria, the equality of speech, not freedom of speech, something different. Then there are these two terms. Demos. Demos meant the poor masses. When demos is translated into Latin, it becomes plebs. Yeah? Plebs is not really understood as being a good sense of the people. Yeah? Plebs means the poor masses. It's a bit like the narodniki. Narodniki, when they talked about narod, what did they mean? They meant the peasants. They didn't just mean everybody in society, they meant the peasants. But like demos at this time, it meant plebs. It meant and that's why it came from the opponents of democracy, because this was a negative term that aristocrats used about the poor masses. Okay? So two words making up the term democracy. Demos and kratos. Kratos means a forcible grip on power. That the poor, the demos, have a grip on power and they keep it away from the rich. That's what it meant. So democracy meant something very different in ancient Athens than it means today. It meant to rule by the poor masses, because they're a majority, who directly have an equal right to have their voices heard in all decisions. Okay? So a very different conception of what we understand it today. So, one ancient classicist in Cambridge, Paul Cartledge, says very interestingly, when people talk about demokratia in the works of ancient Athens, what they mean is something like dictatura proletariat. They meant something like that the poor have a grip on power and the rich are excluded from it. They did this, have a forcible grip of power. And they use this term negatively, because what we know about all of this comes from the aristocrats of ancient Athens. So interestingly, that it actually meant something really quite different back in ancient Athens. Now, interestingly, if we go on to Lenin, Lenin says something very similar. This is Lenin in 1911, talking about every capitalist society would go through an equal bourgeois revolution and so on. What Lenin says here is that the more the poor are involved in social transformation, the more democratic a society will be. Because if it's simply left to the bourgeoisie, if political change is left to the bourgeoisie, is left to the rich in society, what you will have is some compromise between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, and the rights of the poor will be very small. This is Lenin writing in 1911, so long before the revolution of 1917, in the wake of 1905, of course. Now, when Aristotle writes about democracy, about rhetoric, interestingly, he's talking about something called deliberative rhetoric, it's called in English. I believe it's discussione retorica, which means the idea of discussing things in order to be able to make decisions. This is the ancient Greek term for it. But in Aristotle's work, this involves a number of different things. It's not just about manipulation of the emotions. First of all, there's this notion of ethos. And ethos means that if you're trying to address a group of people, you want that group of people to believe you. You want them to have confidence in you. So what you do is you try to convince them that you are trustworthy, that you are honest. You give them reasons to believe that you are honest and trustworthy. Next is pathos. Now, pathos is not exactly the same as paphos in Russian, but it means something like arousing the emotions of the audience. This is where the closest that it gets to the Platonic idea. But then, central to the Aristotelian notion of rhetoric is this notion of pistis, proof, dokazatelstvo, this notion that you have to provide evidence for your argument. If you don't do so in Aristotle, that means you're a worthless and unethical person. And you do this through presenting paradigma. You do this through presenting examples. And your examples that you give in trying to convince somebody of something depends on who you're talking to. So what it means, you have to have some kind of sense of the audience that you're talking to. You don't speak to every audience in the same way. This is what it meant by paradigm. And then, prepon. This means using your evidence, choosing your evidence in such a way that it is the kind of thing that your audience is going to understand and to find convincing. It means you have to have some kind of sociological understanding of your audience. Again, you don't talk to everybody in the same way. And what happens then? This all happened at ancient democracy in Athens. They listened to all of this, and then they voted, and the decision was made. That was how ancient Athens democracy worked. Everybody had direct democratic presentation. Interestingly, let's go back to Lenin. This is a very famous bit from Lenin, 1902. Что делать? Now, interesting, everybody knows Что делать by Lenin. I'm sure everybody knows it. The thing is, Что делать was something that was written in haste. It was a response to an argument by a number of other people. It wasn't meant to be any kind of manifesto or anything like this. It was something that was an occasional piece of work. But here, we see Lenin saying exactly the same thing. Clearly he's drawing upon Aristotelian notions of rhetoric, because he's saying here that as a propagandist and agitator, what matters is how many people you're talking to, but the important thing if you're an agitator is that you present examples. You present an example that is designed to appeal to a particular audience, who are then, this is before the revolution, trying to convince people to go on strike, or trying to convince people to do things in campaigns or something like that. But what they're going to do is talk and do it. So, and he says propagandist basically deals with the written word, pечатное слово, and the agitator uses this живое слово, the idea of the living word. Now the living word, живое слово, Lenin certainly wasn't the first person to come up with this, but it had a really important resonance in Russia at this time. And when we consider writings about language and literature in Russia at this time, this idea of живое слово is really important. So he was actually drawing upon a notion that was already there in Russian culture. Now, живое слово was very much linked to this idea of logic as well. Now, interesting, there were lots of debates going on within the Bolshevik party at this time about this. Another person who was important was, I'm skipping. Okay. Another person who was writing about this stuff at the same time, who was very influential on Western Marxism and on Russian Marxism, was a guy called Ludwig Noire, who, again, you've probably never heard of him, but he's kind of important, not many people. But Ludwig Noire was a philosopher, follower of Schopenhauer, and he was a big influence on, among other people, Plekhanov, and upon Alexander Bogdanov, among other people. Now, Schopenhauer, what Ludwig Noire argued is that language and reason are two sides of the same coin. A bit like Saussure's signifier and signified. Two sides of a piece of paper. You can't have one side without the other. So he said that language and reason are a monon, as he called it, the same thing. And this is used by the term logos in ancient Greek. Logos is what then becomes the Russian term slova. Slova, which doesn't just mean word, of course, it means way of thinking. Начало slova. It's not just about words, it's about logic and ways of thinking. But the first person, well, one of the first people to really talk about this in such a way as it brings into sociological concerns was Ludwig Noire. But for Ludwig Noire, this idea of logos was based on the notion of the will, and this is he got from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer idea that the will is the origin of everything, human will. And what Ludwig Noire argued is that language originates in collective work activity. This didn't come from Engels. Nothing to do with Engels. Engels doesn't even argue this. But this became really important in early Soviet thought. It came from Ludwig Noire that the roots of language arrives in collective labour activity, because this is how will manifests itself. And so what you have is a metaphorical transfer from sounds to the products of labour, and then how you understand and how you apprehend labour, how you understand it. And that language is evident. So if we look at meanings of language, what we find in language, if we analyse meanings of words, what we see is a load of different layers, because of the way that labour has developed and work activity has changed over history. Okay, so this came from Ludwig Noire. It was based, no, it's nothing to do with Marx. It was all based on Schopenhauer. Now, Ludwig Noire's ideas then comes into Russian Marxism, especially from Alexander Bogdanov, Lenin's great foe in the 1990s. Who's Bogdanov? Now, Bogdanov argued that the link between elements of experience come out of our experience of the labour process. So if you're a worker, you think in one way. If you're a member of the bourgeoisie, you think in a different way. If you're an aristocrat, you think in a different way. Because your relationship to the labour process. And this is because of the origin of language. And so the very logic that you use depends upon your sociological origin. So, what we see is that different experiences give rise to different logics, different ways of looking at the world, and therefore different forms of culture. This is where the whole idea of proletarian culture in Bogdanov comes from. It then becomes all the way through early Soviet culture in particular. It doesn't come from Lenin. Lenin was against the idea. This comes from Bogdanov in particular. This is where the idea really originates. And what so it was completely different from Lenin's ideas at the time. And what Bogdanov said they were doing was trying to achieve a general cultural hegemony, as he called it. So a way of different logics are fighting for the minds of the peasantry in particular, and that the outcome of the Russian Revolution will depend upon the extent to which workers have influenced the peasants, or the way that the bourgeoisie influenced the peasants. Right. So this is Bogdanov then. Bogdanov mixing up Marxism and Schopenhauer in particular. Next one, completely different kind of person, Vyacheslav Ivanov, the symbolist poet. Now, the symbolist poet Vyacheslav Ivanov has some very similar ideas. He thinks about them in different kinds of ways, but nevertheless. So he has this idea of Sobornost, that you probably all know about. So this idea that there's a kind of communal experience that comes from ancient Athens, the Dionysian experience, that, as Nietzsche had explained it in The Birth of Tragedy, and that what Ivanov argued was that this notion of logos, or slova, is born in this ancient Athenian gathering that was especially associated with theatre. And that his idea was that Russian culture had an organic connection with ancient Greek culture through the liturgy, through Orthodox Christianity, and that the poetic word, the words of Russian poetry, would be able to link up with your internal cultural world. This is where the notion of Sobornost came from. This is that art had a almost religious significance. So, this is a very aestheticist idea that comes through symbolism. But interestingly, a recent British Marxist, Terry Eagleton, writes an interesting thing about aesthetics. So the whole point of aesthetics, the whole ideal of aesthetics, philosophical aesthetics, is then to change people's way of thinking from inside, not to impose upon them any kind of order or any kind of external logic, but to affect their lives from inside. It's the way of working through and changing your way of thinking and way of feeling from inside. And it's partly physical, partly emotional, partly a matter of reason. So there's this important connection between aesthetics and the idea of hegemony in this way. So he says the aesthetic ideal is that individuals would be fused together in some way, but at the same time separate. To be together and separate. It's very much the notion of subordinist as Ivanov uses it. So you've got people who they maintain their specificity that they're brought together. So there's Ivanov writing between 1905 revolution and 1917 revolution at this time. Now, another interesting person from this, Fadej Zelinsky, most important intellectuals of the Silver Age, particularly wrote a lot about ancient Greek culture and so on. Now Zelinsky says something very similar. The word, slovo, that lay at the basis of both civil life of adults and the upbringing of the young, was the real ruler of the ancient world. He looks back to ancient Athens and the ancient world as something that's governed by this notion of slovo. That people are, that this was the real governor of the world. And he said because in the ancient world this notion of slovo was the central organising force, what you get is then it becomes mythicised. It gets drawn into religious thinking. You find this especially in evangelical words about the Word of God, for example. This is what he called it's the apotheosis of the living word, So you get this movement from the living word again to the written word that happens at this time, supposedly. So, what Zelinsky argues is that what you get in Russia after 1861, after the liberation of the serfs in 1861, that you get the resurrection, as he puts it, of the living word. And it begins with these reforms of 1861. And it's the beginnings of new rise of public speech, oral public speech. And that this, he said, intensified after 1905 revolution. So you get the sudden upsurge of the spoken word. The spoken word in Russian culture. Now, interestingly, after the Russian Revolution, the first commissar of education, the first commissar of culture, Narkom Lunacharsky, here he was both close to Bogdanov and a symbolist poet. Lunacharsky was a symbolist poet, especially dramatist. He had a lot of connections with all of these symbolists at that time. And he was very close to the idea of proletcult. And his ideas, if you look at the early proletcult documents, it's something that is a kind of Leninist politics, and there's a Bogdanov politics just underneath the surface. It's like one on top of another. It's a palimpsest in the sense, you know what a palimpsest is? It's like an ancient manuscript that's been used many times. Something's been written, they rub it off, and they write on it again. So you can see the other, one level of meaning underneath another level. It's a palimpsest. It's the same in Russian and in English. Okay. But the cultural politics that comes up in the 1920s in Russia, generally Bogdanov's ideas about proletarian culture at that time, that really comes to fruition. And Lunacharsky is a real mishmash collection of different ideas. Some Leninist ideas, some Bogdanov ideas, some symbolist ideas. And he puts it in, when he speaks at the opening of the Institute of the Living Word, So the goal of the proletariat's cultural enlightenment industry is to arm the working class with knowledge and, note this, to organise its feelings through art. So art has this important rhetorical function. Now the interesting thing about this is that where this is really developed is the theatrical section of the Commissariat of Enlightenment, of Narkomplus. Yeah? The teatralna section of Narkomplus. This is where it really comes to fruition. Because here you have the production of a whole load of different institutes that come up at this time. These institutes, they combine all of these trends at the beginning of the 1920s. They combine especially the idea of collectivism and the idea of Isegoria that I talked about, the equality of speech. How important the equality of speech was at this time is really important. Now, the Institute Живого слова in Petrograd opens in 1919. Lunacharsky speaks there, and he says the point of the Institute Живого слова is to teach the people to speak publicly, from the small to the large. Everybody must learn to speak publicly. And Zelinsky then gets up and speaks at the opening of the Institute Живого слова, and he says that Athenian democracy was the cell, the yacheka, that fed the living word. Democracy and the living word are inseparable. This was Zelinsky speaking at the opening of that institute. Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, at one point she says, Russia is the new Athens. The new Athens, it's the new democratic forum, the new place where the living word, the whole rule of logos is to be found. Lunacharsky then, 1919, speaking at the opening of the Institute Diplomacy in Moscow. He says that the work would be the goal to restore the fundamental tone of the Russian Revolution towards collective, creative feeling. So all of this political and philosophical background is important for those of us who are interested in philology in the early Soviet Union, because it led to a whole load of new research programs, a whole load of new ways of looking at philology comes at this time. Before this time, philology had concentrated almost exclusively on written language. Now, Живое слово becomes a central part of early Soviet research institutes. So how you study the spoken word, the language of the people. Because after the revolution, what you have is this load of non-standard forms of language flood into official life. The language starts to change because a whole new social group of people are involved in administration. So everything starts to change in this respect. So you need then to be able to understand these things. There's a lot of debates that take over, especially during the Civil War and just after, about the democratization of language, how the old language of the aristocracy is no longer sufficient for the new society in revolutionary conditions in the public sphere, leading back to this idea of democracy as well. So there's this dichotomy that starts to grow about Живое слово, but against the мертвое слово, the dead language of the old, lived-out aristocratic culture. Oops. But also, of course, it was very important to standardise languages and to spread literacy among the poor in particular. So, interestingly, this was not only in Russia, of course. A very interesting book called Langage et la vie by Charles Bally was published in 1913. Was then appeared in Russian translation extremely quickly. And if you were an aspirant at most of the institutes in Leningrad in particular, in the 1920s, this was one of the things you had to read. Now, interestingly in this, Charles Bally says that the conversational language of ordinary people continues its onward march, all the more securely for being underground. It flows under the living, it flows like the river underneath an ice sheet. Then one day the ice breaks and the new language of the people comes to the surface. Because this is the living language. And it returns culture and language to movement, gives it new life. This is Charles Bally writing in 1913. Again, very, very influential in Russia at that time. Now, what we find, this is quoted in a number of different places. One of them among the works of a really important philologist, Boris Larin. Boris Larin, 1928, writes this article, The Linguistic Study of the City, in which he argues that he talks about the urban folklore, non-canonical forms of language, of written language and conversational speech. It now exerts this direct and powerful influence on the norms of the official language. This is one of the main effects of urbanisation. And urbanisation, of course, in Russia particularly begins after 1861. It gathers pace with the First World War, and then after the revolution with industrialisation, you get urbanisation happens very quickly. And so connected with urbanisation is this spread of the non-standard forms of language. And here's another part of this. Then all strata of the continual linguistic interaction of all strata of the urban population, the habitual employment on the others, on the other discourses, other speeches, and the social neighbours and antipodes. So the careless search for new ways of expression in terms of the rich depths of the city, he talks about, the linguistic depths of the city. The historical evolution of any literary language may be presented as a series of successive lowering, the snizhenie, we use this term snizhenie, or barbarization, varvarizatsiya, he talks of language. It happens at the time. So new kind of concentric deployments, he says, concentric deployments. So this linguistic study of the city takes this notion of living word and uses it as it becomes a new part of a new kind of research project. Before that, we have Lev Yakubinsky, writing at the Institute Живого слова. He's one of the main speakers of the Institute Живого слова, 1921. And he talks about face-to-face dialogue, so Живое слово, where he talks about the characteristics of discursive interaction, different forms of dialogue, as he puts it. Then, and he says there's deixis, the way that language points to things outside of itself. Deictic expressions, bodily facial gestures, elliptical phrasing, and so on. And that these are contrasted with forms of monologue. that he said, one's a monologue, then distanced, elaborated forms of poetic interaction. Monologue is connected with higher social groups, and dialogue with familiarity and solidarity. Forms of familiarity and solidarity. And this is where I just bring this to an end, because all of this background is really important if we want to understand how the research program that laid the basis for Bakhtin's ideas really come from. It comes out of German philosophy and so on, but it also comes out of this institutional political process that informed these different questions. So, the Bakhtin circle then, well, we find exactly the same thing arises. In the works of Valentin Voloshinov, there's a dichotomy then of this slovesное взаимодействие. And this is against this idea that he got from Saussure, that Saussure actually thought that the language was a synchronic system of language, which Saussure didn't actually think language was a synchronic system. He just said that linguists need to look at language as if it was a synchronic system. But this is not the way that Voloshinov saw it, or that many people saw it at the time. Also, this is where we get this contrast of monologue and dialogue. How this comes into Bakhtin. It comes from all of this background and goes back to ancient Athens in many respects. But also, it's mixed up with this dichotomy of, there's an idea of living culture, the dichotomy of life, and then this idea of objective culture that Georg Simmel talked about in particular. And Simmel wrote this, I've spelled Simmel wrong here, it should be a Z in Russian. But Simmel uses this dichotomy of life and culture. But this, linking this to questions of democracy and so on, was something that was specifically Russian at this time, linking on to ancient stuff. It's also there in the idea of Bakhtin's ideas that the novelist is somehow a critic of official culture, of the way that culture, that language becomes routinized, the way that it becomes ossified, the way that it becomes stagnant, and the way that this is related to the language of different social groups. It goes all the way back to there. This idea of the novel as a democratizing organ of culture goes back to these very concerns that are happening at that time. We often don't think about them going back to there. The fact that it has a kind of corrosive effect on the official culture. So, as we see, when we look for Russian sources, if you want, of many of Bakhtin's ideas, the ideas of Bakhtin's ideas, they're not necessarily where you would expect to find them. They go back to a whole tradition of ideas about democracy and so on, which are very different to the kind of liberal bourgeois democracy that we find being presented as a model to us today. So that when we talk about these ideas that Bakhtin has about language and culture and democratization, they're rather more subversive, if you like. They're rather more radical than a simple liberalism, where whole spheres of social life would be excluded from any kind of democratic cultural intervention. And that's all I have to say today. Thank you.
Есть ли вопросы? Я хотел в рамках идеологического обмена репликами уточнить вашу позицию, ваш доклад. Все это очень интересно. Первый вопрос. В рамках какой научной парадигмы строился ваш доклад? То есть это что? История социологии, политики, история речи, речевого взаимодействия, история лингвистики. Дело в том, что у нас наш университет очень большая организация, у нас есть коллеги, работающий на в историко-социологическом институте, который профессионально занимается политологией. Жалко, что здесь нет. Вот, есть
они у вас совсем не
лингвисты там, и так далее.
Какой дисциплины?
Да, то есть первый вопрос такой. В рамках какой научной парадигмы строился ваш доклад? Потому что легкое впечатление от разнообразия имен создает некоторую иллюзию, может быть, иллюзию некоторого такого методологического сумбура, вот, эклектизма некоторого для меня, в моем понимании. Вот. Второй такой вопрос и второе пожелание. Попробуйте кратко сформулировать основные выводы, основные тезисы того, о чем вы сказали, чтобы мы лучше поняли общую стратегию этого выступления.
Я постараюсь объяснить на русском. Начало советской времени, после революции, эти идеи, что есть отдельные дисциплины, просто несуществуют. Поэтому лингвистика, конечно, еще не было вообще, потому что это была просто часть филологии. Но тогда, чтобы было четкие разделения между дисциплинами, просто отказались тогда, начало 20-х годов. Потом, в 30-х годах, тогда, конечно, перестали разделение такие. Поэтому научные проблемы, политические проблемы, филологические проблемы, философские проблемы, все вместе передумали эти времена. Из-за революции, из-за резкие социальные сдвиги. Да? Очень много разных движений. Поэтому мне кажется, что такой вопрос, что в какой дисциплине, это анахронизм. Если мы думаем исторически, это что-то не знаю.
Ваша точка зрения понятна.
Да, можно еще кое-что прокомментировать. Здесь интересен и альтернативный взгляд на ту историю, которую пытается реконструировать глазами коллеги из Грейт-Британии. Вот, у нас у профессионалов из России, профессионалов в разных областях, может быть и своя точка зрения. Ну, например, политические и вербальные свободы в России, на мой взгляд, я думаю, не только на мой, возникают не в связи с реформами 60-х годов, а в связи со смертью Николая I. Вот, это середина 50-х. Вот, во всяком случае, свобода критики и так далее, она с этого момента. Вот. Что касается истории русского литературного языка, этот аспект не особенно близок, потому что больше 20 лет я читал лекции по истории русского литературного языка в нашем университете. Вот, и влияние разговорной стихии и крупных социальных процессов, как революция, эта тема, тоже, на мой взгляд, может быть скорректирована с точки зрения нашей науки, скажем, славистики, русистики, которая сложилась. Вот. Просто вы это имеете в виду, что мы могли бы что-то и добавить к сказанному.
Ну, конечно, фольклор, изучение фольклора и так далее.
Из 60-х годов, я думаю, уже Пушкина никак нельзя. Значит.
Нет, мы же говорим не об индивидуальностях, а об общественности.
Остановление научной языки, тоже происходит.
Да. Ну, например, это институт живого слова, например. Это очень интересный институт. Там, конечно, работал, ну, в старости уже Кони, его юрист, да, он там работает. И Зеленский тоже думал, что это легальные реформы после Первой русской революции. Это было начало стимулизации, наверное, стимуляции вот, живого слова. Ну, раньше было какое-то, все было написано, что было кодекс и так далее, надо было невозможно было просто спорить против закона. Но стало возможно из-за революции. Как они думают? Можно сказать, что, конечно, неправильно, так они думают. И в институте живого слова, конечно, институт живого слова – это не лингвистический институт, это юридический институт, это институт культурологии, можно сказать, но это анахронизм тоже. Журнализм, но все было вместе. Это была какая-то смесь взаимодействия разных специалистов и так далее. Там, как мы знаем, работал и Бахтинский, и много разных фигуры, которые потом были очень влиятельны в философии. Ну, я просто имею в виду, как они поняли задача филологии после революции.
Вопрос такой, а это связано как-то с тем, что простой народ научился наконец-то читать и писать с грамотностью?
Да.
Связано ведь как-то?
Да.
Поэтому после революции это стало очень актуально, да?
Да.
До этого владели же культурой только те, кто читал,
Да.
кто элита, да?
Конечно.
И вот в связи с этим роман. Как понимать роман органов демократизации культуры? Это в связи с тем, что все читают и из романов черпают культуру?
Да, правильно, конечно. Но я думаю, что Бахтин в этом смысле, он думает, что это просто есть репрезентации языков в обществе, не только один голос, не только официальные подходы, но там есть репрезентация. Ну, конечно.
Полифония, да?
Полифония, да. Ну, конечно. Действительно, это правильно. Можно, конечно, под вопросом поставить, потому что всегда это через интеллектуал, романист. Он выбрал и собрал. Тогда, конечно, можно ставить под вопросом. Интересно, что так предлагал.
Но у романа широкий читатель, да?
Да. Ну, конечно, например, под вопросом, если, например, работа Рабле, как он считал, это просто как выражение мнений и сознания народа. А как это может быть? Ну, конечно, романист переработал все.
Спасибо. Больше нет вопросов? Спасибо вам большое. Еще раз спасибо.